Della Rourke had cooked for the Purcell freight outfit for 9 years, and in all that time she'd never once been asked to sit at the far end of a table she'd set. That fall, at the Council Grove stop, a circuit preacher asked her a third time about her husband. She set down the coffee mill in her lap. She told him, in a voice that closed a door, to leave the subject be. She did not raise it. She never did. The preacher wasn't a cruel man. He pressed her anyway. "A woman your age," he said, unwed, "on a road full of men, folks will talk." 31 freighters sat around that fire and heard him say it. Della said nothing back. And not one of those men knew the thing that sat behind her quiet. She wasn't certain she was free to marry anyone alive. 4 evenings later, the wagon master stood up at that same fire, 55 years old, 6 years at her side on the road. He asked her, in front of every man there, to marry him. She was silent a full minute. And then, she asked him one question. "If you believe it's never too late for the heart, this story is for you." Before we go on, do this old road a small kindness. Subscribe so the story finds you again. And down in the comments, tell me the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this old road travels, and how many of you are riding it with me tonight. Now, let me take you back and tell it the way it happened. Della Rourke came to the Santa Fe Road 9 years back with a good hand for sourdough and a way of not being asked twice about anything. She came up from the Missouri railhead on a freight wagon with a busted axle and a driver who died of a lung fever 2 weeks after he hired her. The outfit kept her on. They were glad to. A man will forgive a great deal of hard country if there's a hot biscuit waiting at the end of it. The run went from the Missouri end, out past Council Grove, on down the trail toward the New Mexico country. Weeks of it. Dust in summer that got in your teeth. Cold in the fall that got in your bones. The wagons carried dry goods and nails and bolts of cloth going west, and hides and wool coming back, and 31 men who lived hard and slept in the open, and would have walked through fire for the woman who fed them. That's not a way of speaking. They'd have done it. Because Della didn't just cook. She kept them. She knew which man had a bad tooth and which one was fretting over a wife back home. She knew that Pardee, the old mule skinner, took his coffee near black and would sooner die than say thank you. She knew young Tom Ackley, who'd signed on green that spring, was homesick down to the soles of his boots, and she'd slip him an extra spoon of molasses without a word passing between them. She fed 31 men, and she paid attention to all of them, and she asked nothing of any of them. That was the arrangement. Della gave, and Della did not take, and the taking was the part she guarded. You could see the whole of the woman in how she ran a morning. She was up before the birds. She had a coffee mill, an old wooden one, iron crank, a drawer at the bottom worn smooth from her thumb, and she'd sit with it in her lap in the blue dark and grind. That sound was the outfit's rooster. Men rolled out of their blankets to the sound of Della grinding coffee. And here's the thing about the mornings. The small thing that was really the whole thing. She ground Josiah Breck's cup first. Every dawn. Before her own. Before anyone's. Josiah was the wagon master. 55. Gray coming in hard at the temples, big hands gone to leather from 40 years of rope and rain. He was not a talker. Some men aren't built for it. And he was one. But he had a way of saying things without his mouth. The first thing he ever did for her, the first true thing, he did without a word. The wind on that road can gutter a fire flat in a second, and a guttered fire means cold men and raw dough and a long, ugly day. Della's first week, before anybody knew her, Josiah pulled a wagon around crossways to the north of her cook fire. Made a windbreak of it. Didn't ask, didn't explain, just set it there and walked off to see to the mules. He did it every camp after that. 9 years of camps. He never once said why, and she ground his coffee first. She never once said why either. That was the marriage, if you want to call it that, and I think you should. Not a word spoken, not a hand held, just a man setting a wall against the wind and a woman turning a crank in the dark. Two people saying the truest thing they had in the only language they'd let themselves speak. Everybody in that outfit saw it. Nobody named it. You didn't name a thing like that. You just warmed your hands at it. I want you to like them both before I tell you what stood between them. Because it wasn't a villain. There's no villain in this. It was the world. Just the plain, hard rules of the world, wearing an ordinary face. The face, that fall, belonged to Reverend Silas Coyle. He rode the Council Grove circuit. A decent man. I'll say that now and I'll hold to it, because it's easy to make a preacher the heavy in a story like this, and that's not the truth of him. He believed the rules were a kindness. He believed they held the roof up over people who'd fall through without them. He wasn't wrong, exactly. That was the trouble with him. He was never all the way wrong. They pulled into Council Grove to lay over and reload. There was a church there, and a store, and the last stretch of settled country before the long empty run. Coyle came out to the camp to visit, the way he did, and he sat at the fire and drank Della's coffee and praised it honest, and then he did the thing he'd done twice before on twice before layovers. He asked her about her husband, not unkindly. That's what made it land the way it did. He asked the way a man asks who's decided a thing is his business because he means well. A woman your age, he said, unwed, on a road full of men. It isn't seemly, Mrs. Rourke, and I say it because I'd see you safe. Folks talk. A name and a ring would put a stop to it. Della set the coffee mill down in her lap. She looked at him a moment. Then she told him, plain and low, to leave the subject be. That was all. No heat in it. No plea. Just a door closing. Quiet. The way a door closes when the person shutting it has shut it 1,000 times and knows exactly how far it has to swing. 31 men heard it. 31 men found something else to look at. And Josiah Breck, at the edge of the firelight, heard it too, and said not one word. Now here's where you have to lean in close, because the biggest thing in this whole story got said quiet, off to the side, and thrown away like it was nothing. Later that night, when the fire had burned down and the preacher had gone back to town, old Pardee sat cleaning a hamestrap next to young Tom Ackley. The boy was still fretting over the whole business, the way the young do, wanting to understand a thing that wasn't his to understand. And Pardee, who never gossiped, who'd have skinned any man he caught doing it, told the boy the one thing he knew, low, so it wouldn't carry. She was married once, he said. Back in Missouri. Girl of 19, man walked off inside a year and was never heard of again. She don't speak of it. So you don't either. That was it. That was the whole of it. Pardee said it the way you'd mention the weather from a decade back, and went on with the hamestrap, and the boy nodded and let it go. But somebody else heard. Josiah Breck was in the dark, just past the wagons, seeing to a mule that had thrown a shoe, and the still night carried Pardee's low voice right to him. Married once. Man walked off. Never heard of again. He stood there in the dark a long moment with his hand on the mule's flank. He didn't come to the fire. He didn't say anything, then or after. But the next dawn, before Della was up, before the birds, before the blue had even come into the sky, a man rolled out of his blankets, went to the cook wagon, and took down the old coffee mill. And Josiah Breck ground her coffee first. The first time in 9 years he'd ever done it. He had it hot and poured and set at the corner of the tailgate when she came round the wagon, and he was already gone to the mules like it hadn't happened. She stood there looking at that cup a long time. She understood exactly what it meant. That's the part that broke your heart a little, if you were watching. She understood, and she couldn't let herself pick it up too quick, because a thing like that, once you take it, you've said yes to something. So she stood there. And then she drank it. And she said nothing. And he said nothing, and the wagons rolled out at first light like it was any other morning on the road. But it wasn't. Something had turned. You could feel it in the outfit for days, the way you can feel weather coming before the sky shows it. Now I have to tell you about the note, because the note is the clock, and there's a clock ticking under all of this, whether these people want to hear it or not. Josiah Breck had bought land. Not for himself, though he'd never have said so out loud. A quarter section at the Kansas end of the run, with a station lot on it, good water, a stand of cottonwood. He'd been paying it down for years out of a wagon master's wages, which is to say slowly, dollar by dollar. He meant it for a home. When the road's done, he'd say, if he said anything at all, which he mostly didn't. A place to light. A place a man could set a table and know it'd be in the same spot come morning. But he'd had to borrow against it to close the deal, and the lender was an outfit called the Cottonwood Valley Land and Loan, and the note was $640, and it came due in 90 days. $640. On a wagon master's pay, in 1871, that was a mountain. And 90 days to climb it. He hadn't told a soul. But Della kept the outfit's books. That was one more thing she did that nobody had asked her to, and everybody let her. And Della had seen the ledger. And Della could add. She knew about the note. She knew about the clock. She just didn't say she knew. Because that was how the two of them talked. In things left unsaid and things quietly done. And into that came Harmon Deal. Deal kept the store at Council Grove. A widower, 49, well off by the standards of that little town, with a good coat and a way of standing that told you he thought well of himself. He was not a bad man either. I keep saying that, don't I? And I keep meaning it, because that's the honest shape of this story. Decent people and a hard world. But Deal had a coldness in him where warmth ought to have been, and he mistook it for good sense. He'd taken a notion about Della. And one afternoon in the store, while she was laying in flour and salt pork for the run, he made her an offer. He put it delicately. He was proud of how delicately he put it. A woman alone, he said, gets asked questions she'd maybe rather not answer. But a widow, now, a widow is a respectable thing, and nobody checks a widow's story. He said it just like that. A widow's an honest word for a woman nobody can check on. Marry me quiet, he said. No fuss, no letters, no clerks, no questions. Nobody need ever know a thing that isn't their business. You'd be safe. You'd be settled. And the past would stay where you left it. He thought he was being generous. That was the thing about Harmon Deal. He offered her a lie to hide behind and honestly believed it was a gift. Della thanked him. She didn't get angry. Anger would have been giving him more than the moment was worth. She just told him no, plain, the way she'd told the preacher to leave the subject be, and she carried her flour out to the wagon. But something in what he'd said sat wrong in her all that day and into the night. Because he'd named the exact thing she was most afraid of and dressed it up as safety. A promise nobody could check on. A promise with no witnesses. A promise a man could keep or quietly not keep, and no one would ever be the wiser. She'd had one of those already. She'd married one at 19. And out past the store, out past the town, the sky in the west had gone the color of a bruise, and the men were watching it, because a storm was building over the Cottonwood crossing, and everybody who'd run that road knew what the Cottonwood could do when it came up. I'll get you to the storm. But first, I have to bring you to the fire. Because 4 evenings after Reverend Coyle asked his question, the biggest thing that had ever happened to Della Rourke happened in front of 31 men. They'd made camp early that evening, just short of the crossing, waiting to see what the water would do. Supper was done. The men were easy, full, a few of them smoking, the fire high and popping. Della sat where she always sat, a little apart, the coffee mill in her lap, grinding for the morning the way she did every night. And Josiah Breck stood up. Now, Josiah stood up 100 times a night, to check a mule, to bank the fire, to look at the sky. So, nobody thought a thing of it at first. But he didn't go to the mules. He walked around the fire, into the light, and he stopped in front of Della, and he took off his hat. A man like Josiah does not take off his hat at his own fire. The whole camp went still. You could hear the fire. You could hear the crank of the mill slow and stop in Della's lap. He said her name, just her name first. Della, and then, in front of every man there, in that flat, plain voice that never asked anybody for anything, he asked her to marry him. I want you to see it, because it was the most naked thing any of those men had ever watched a person do. The firelight on 31 faces, old Pardee with his mouth half open. Young Ackley gone white, the mules shifting in the dark. And an old wagon master standing bareheaded in front of a woman with his hat in his two big hands, having finally run clean out of ways to say it without words. Della didn't move. The mill sat dead in her lap. She was silent a full minute. A full minute. The kind of silence that gets longer the longer it goes. The kind where every man at that fire started praying to be anywhere else, and none of them so much as breathed. A minute is a very long time when a person's whole life is turning on it. And then Della Rourke asked her one question. Not the question you'd expect. Not whether he loved her, she knew that. She'd known it for 9 years. It was built into the windbreak of that wagon. Not what he could give her. She asked him something else, and she asked it out loud, so every man there would be a witness to it. Will you wait? She said. However long it takes, to learn whether I'm even free to be asked? And if the word comes back no, if it turns out I'm not free, will you take that no and let me go, in front of all these men, and never hold it against me? You could have heard a pin drop in Kansas. The men didn't understand it. Not all of it. But they understood enough. They understood that this quiet woman who'd fed them for 9 years had just told them, without telling them, that there was a lock on her life she couldn't open. And they understood that she'd said it out loud on purpose, so that whatever the man answered, they'd all have heard it, and he could never take it back in the dark. Josiah Breck put his hat back on his head. He took his time about it. And then he answered her, so that every man at that fire heard every word. I'll wait, he said, as long as the road is long. And if the answer comes back no, he stopped, and he looked around at the men, and then back at her. If the answer's no, I'll be the first one to say it. Right here. In front of all of them. So you never have to say it yourself. The men looked at their boots. Every one of them, 31 grown men who'd seen every hard thing the trail could show them, and they couldn't look at those two by the fire, because it was too much, and it was too plain, and it was the truest thing they'd ever been in the room for. Nothing more got said. Della picked the mill back up and finished grinding the morning's coffee. Josiah went to see to the mules. The men found their blankets, and the storm came up over the cottonwood in the night with a sound like the end of the world. Here's what the outfit decided, though nobody called a meeting and nobody put it to a vote. They decided, to a man, to behave as though nothing had been said. Not out of coldness, out of the opposite. They'd watched Della guard her quiet for 9 years, and they'd just watched her ask for time. And so, they gave her time the only way rough men know how, by pretending, all of them, that they hadn't heard a thing. They didn't tease Josiah. They didn't whisper. When Ackley, being young, started once to say something at the fire, old Pardee put a hand on the boy's arm, and the boy shut his mouth and never opened it on the subject again. It was a wall of silence, and it was built out of pure decency, and it was maybe the finest thing those men ever did. They just closed ranks around the two of them and waited, the way you'd bank a fire to keep it through a cold night. If you've ever had people like that in your life, people who protect you by asking nothing, then you know what Della had, even if she couldn't yet let herself feel it. And the road went on, because the road always goes on, and it kept testing them, the way it did. The cottonwood came up in the night till it was a brown, roaring thing, and in the gray morning one of the freight wagons, loaded, heavy, worth more than a year of any man's wages, bogged at the crossing and started to go over in the current. Everything on it would have been lost, and maybe a man or two with it. It was Della who saw the line to run and called it. She'd watched that crossing for 9 years, and she knew its moods better than the men who fought it. She had them rig the team's cross current instead of straight, throwing the pull against the water instead of into it, and they saved the wagon and everything on it. A full load, as good as a whole harvest pulled out of the flood. That was one. Hold on to it, because in that outfit, from then on, a thing was building, degree by degree. Call it trust, call it proof, call it a ledger of a different kind. Every time she stood shoulder to shoulder with those men and pulled them through, the thing got one notch deeper, and Josiah watched it get deeper, and said nothing, and set his wagon against the wind. Then came the fever. It was Josiah who took it, some weeks on. A camp fever, the kind that could kill a man his age, that burned him up and left him raving in the back of a wagon while the outfit lay over, because you don't move a man in that state. 3 nights. Della didn't leave him for 3 nights. She sat in the back of that wagon and cooled him and made him take water and talked to him low when he didn't know where he was. The men brought her what she asked for and took over her cooking, badly, and nobody said a word about the impropriety of it. Because the wall of silence held, and because a man was dying and the woman who could maybe stop it was the woman who ground his coffee first. On the 3rd night the fever broke. He came up out of it near dawn, weak as a kitten, and the first thing his eyes found was Della, sitting there, the coffee mill in her lap. She'd been grinding it in the dark to have something for her hands to do. He looked at her a long time. Then he said the only thing he had strength for. He said, "You should have slept." And she said, "I'll sleep when you're up on the seat again." And that was all. But that was another notch. That was 2. And still, this is the part that'll make you want to shake her, and I understand it, but hear her out. Still, she hadn't written the letter. Because there was a letter to be written. You've known it this whole time, haven't you? Somewhere in Harlan County, Missouri, there was a courthouse, and a clerk, and a record, or the lack of one. Somewhere there was the answer to whether Elias Vance, the man who'd married her at 19 and walked off inside a year, was alive or dead, whether Della Rourke was a widow free to marry, or a wife still bound to a ghost. 1 letter. That's all it would take to ask, and Della couldn't make herself write it. You have to understand what the letter was to her. As long as she didn't ask, she could hope. As long as the question stayed unasked, the answer could still be the one she wanted. Writing it meant it might come back wrong. Writing it meant maybe learning, for certain, that she was not free, that Josiah's fire promise would have to be paid, that she'd have to stand in front of 31 men and be let go. As long as she didn't write it, she'd never have to hear him say no. So, she circled it. For weeks, she circled it. And every soul watching this knows what she has to do, and has to sit there while she doesn't do it, and that's a particular kind of ache, watching someone you love hold the key to their own door and be too afraid to turn it. The clock kept ticking on the note. Meanwhile, $640, and the 90 days burning down. They laid over at Council Grove again mid-run, and there was a clerk from the Cottonwood Valley Land and Loan there, a soft young man with clean hands and a superior way about him, come to look into Josiah's account and, if he could, to find a reason to call the note early. That was the kind of outfit the Land and Loan was. A man late by $1 was a man they could take a quarter section from. Della squared the books against that clerk. She sat down with him and the outfit's ledger, and she was better with figures than he was by a country mile, and she caught 2 errors in the land and loan's own reckoning that fell in Josiah's favor and bought the note some breathing room, not paid off, not near it, but no longer able to be called early on a technicality. The clerk didn't like it. He liked it less that a camp cook had done it to him. But the numbers were the numbers, and he packed up his superior manner and went back to town with nothing. That was 3. 3 times now she'd stood in the gap and held the line for that outfit, and every man knew it, and the wall of silence around her and Josiah just got thicker and warmer, and still nobody said a word. And Harmon Deal made his offer one more time. He caught her at the store, the last afternoon of that layover. He'd heard about the fire, about the proposal. The whole town had heard, because 31 men can keep a secret from strangers, but not from a town they buy their whiskey in. And Deal, in his cold, decent way, saw an opening. And he took it. "You're going to have to write a letter now, aren't you?" he said. "To some clerk back in Missouri, and you're afraid to, because you don't know what it'll say." He wasn't unkind about it. That was Deal all over. "Marry me instead," he said. No letters, no clerks, no question that can ever be answered wrong, because it'll never be asked. Nobody need ever know. You'd never have to find out. And there it was, laid bare, the exact shape of the thing. He was offering her a way to never turn the key. A marriage built on the question staying unasked forever. A promise no one could check. And that was the moment Della Rourke understood, all the way down, what she'd been afraid of her whole life. It wasn't the answer. It was the not knowing, dressed up as safety, offered to her twice now by 2 different men, once at 19, by a man who made a private promise and walked off, and now again by a man who wanted to build a whole marriage out of a question no one would ever ask. A private promise was the one thing she could not afford. It was the one thing that had already ruined her once. She told Harmon Deal no. And this time there was a little heat in it. Just a little. The first she'd shown anybody in this whole story. She told him she'd rather know the worst true thing than live inside a comfortable lie, and she thanked him for showing her the difference, though she didn't say what she meant by that, and he didn't understand it, and she walked out of the store into the light, and she went straight to the Council Grove post office, and she sat down at the little counter with the stub of a pencil, and she wrote the letter. She wrote it to the clerk of Harlan County, Missouri. She asked, in plain words, for any record of one Elias Vance, a marriage, 9 years and more gone by, and whatever might have become of the man since. Whether he lived. Whether he died. She asked for the truth, whatever it was, and she gave the outfit's route so a reply could catch up to her on the road. Her hand shook a little, doing it. 9 years she'd guarded that door, and here she was, of her own free will, knocking on it from the inside. She sealed it. She paid the postage. She watched the postmaster toss it in the sack for the eastbound, and she stood there a moment as if she could still call it back, and then she couldn't, and it was gone. She'd done it. She'd chosen the truth over the safety of never knowing. Not Josiah, not the preacher, not Deal. She'd done it herself, with her own hand and her own pencil. Whatever came back now, it was coming, because she'd asked for it. She walked back out to the camp in the long evening light, and Josiah was setting his wagon against the wind for the morning fire, the way he had 10,000 times, and he looked up at her, and something in her face told him. He didn't ask. He never asked. But he knew she'd done a hard thing, and he set the brake and came around and stood near her, not touching, just near, the way he did. Neither of them said a word about it, but now there was a letter in a mail sack on the eastbound road carrying a question a dozen years in the asking, and somewhere in Missouri a clerk would open it and go to a shelf and find a record, or find nothing at all. And whatever he found, he'd write it down and send it back down this same long road to find her. 11 weeks, a letter took, out to Harlan County and back. 11 weeks of camps and crossings and dawn coffee ground in the dark. 11 weeks to learn whether Della Rourke was free or whether an old wagon master was going to have to keep the second half of a promise he'd made to her in front of 31 men. And the answer was already coming. It was already in the sack, already on the road, already rolling toward her a little closer every single day. She just didn't know yet what it was going to cost her when it came. 11 weeks is a long time when you're counting it in dawns. Della counted it in dawns. She counted it in the coffee mill, in the iron crank turning under her thumb, in the same worn drawer she pulled out full of grounds every morning before the light. She ground Josiah's cup first. She always had. And now every turn of that crank was one more turn closer to a letter she couldn't call back. The outfit rolled west out of Council Grove into the long grass. Then it rolled back east. Then west again. That's the road. It doesn't care what's in the mail sack. It just wants pulling. Nobody spoke of the fire. Nobody spoke of the questions she'd asked or the answer Josiah gave. 31 men had heard it, and 31 men held it like a hot coal in a bare hand and said nothing. Pardee didn't. Ackley didn't. Galt, who'd talk the ears off a mule, didn't. They decided, without deciding out loud, that until Della knew, there was nothing to know. So they ate her sourdough, and they said thank you, and they hitched up in the dark, and they waited with her, whether she wanted the company of it or not. That's a kind of love, too. It doesn't have a preacher. The fever came the third week out. It took Josiah in the low country past the cottonwood, the shakes first, then the heat, then the kind of talking to no one that scares a camp worse than Indians. He went down in his own wagon and couldn't get up, and the outfit stood around the tailgate, not knowing what to do with their hands. Della knew what to do with hers. She put a boy on the fire and a boy on the water, and she climbed up into that wagon. And she stayed. 3 nights. She wrung out cloths in creek water gone cold and laid them on his chest and his forehead and the backs of his wrists. She spooned broth past his teeth when he'd take it. When he wouldn't, she waited and tried again. She talked to him low, not about anything, just talk, the way you'd gentle a spooked horse. On the second night he got hold of her wrist in the dark. Not hard, just held it, the way a drowning man holds a rope without knowing it's a rope. She let him. She sat there with her wrist in his burning hand, and she didn't pull it back, and she didn't turn it into anything. She just let him hold on till the fever eased and his fingers went slack. On the third dawn the heat broke, and he slept clean, and Della climbed down out of that wagon gray in the face, and ground the coffee, and poured his cup first same as ever, and set it by his hand for when he woke. The men saw all of it. They didn't say a word. But something got settled in that camp, those 3 nights, that no vow could have settled plainer. Then, there was the land and loan clerk. They'd stopped at the railhead to load, and the clerk from Cottonwood Valley came out to remind Josiah, in that soft way clerks have, about the $640 and the 90 days and how time was time. He had the outfit's freight tally in his hand, and he was reading it wrong. On purpose or not, Della never decided, but he was reading it wrong, and it came out $60 short in the company's favor and against Josiah's. Della kept the outfit's books. She'd kept them 9 years. She took the ledger off the freight wagon, and she set it on the barrelhead next to his, and she went down the columns with her pencil, line by line, out loud, slow, the way you'd read to a child. The clerk got redder every line. By the bottom of the page, the $60 was back where it belonged, and there was breathing room on the note besides, and the clerk folded his paper and tipped his hat to her, not to Josiah, and went inside. Josiah watched her do it. He didn't say thank you. He walked over and set his wagon a little tighter against the wind for her fire that evening, and she understood him fine. The norther came in the 9th week. It came the way they come out there, no manners at all, a wall of gray dropping the temperature 40 degrees between one breath and the next, and then the snow going sideways so you couldn't see the lead team from the box. They got the wagons circled. They got the stock in close. And in the counting up, Tom Ackley wasn't in it. Green Tom Ackley, the homesick boy who'd signed on that spring, had gone out after a strayed mule, and the white had swallowed him. You don't send the whole camp into a norther. You send the two who won't get lost. Della tied a rope to the wagon wheel and the other end to her waist, and Josiah tied on behind her, and they went out into it together, hand over hand along the rope, shouting into a wind that ate the shouting whole. They found the boy 50 yards out, already sitting down in the snow, already going quiet and warm the deadly way. Between them, they got him up. Josiah on one side, Della on the other, the boy's arms over their shoulders, and they hauled him back along that rope through the white with their heads down and their bodies touching all the way, shoulder to the shared weight of a life between them. They got him to the fire. They stripped the wet off him and put Della's own blankets on him and put him between the two warmest bodies in the camp, and Della fed him hot coffee a spoonful at a time till the shivering came back, and the shivering coming back is the good sign, out there. The bad sign is when it stops. That night the whole outfit sat close around the fire, packed in against the cold, and Della and Josiah ended up under the edge of the same blanket, thrown over the both of them by somebody, Pardee most likely, without a word. Their shoulders touched, neither of them moved away, neither of them turned it into more. They just sat there under the one blanket in the roar of the storm, the way you'd sit with someone you'd already spent a lifetime beside. The near of it was almost too much. She felt it in her whole side, the warmth of him, 6 years of it, 9 years of it. And she thought about the letter out there somewhere on this same buried road, coming, and she pulled the blanket a little higher and said nothing at all. The reply reached Council Grove in the 11th week. The postmaster held it up when the outfit rolled in, a single folded letter, and Della crossed the yard to take it, and her hands were steady, which surprised her. 9 years of grinding coffee before dawn gives you steady hands whether you want them or not. She didn't open it in the street. She carried it back to the cook wagon, and she sat down on the tailgate with the coffee mill in her lap, the iron crank cold under her thumb, and Josiah came and stood near her, not touching, the way he did. A few of the men drifted close, and then made themselves busy nearby, close enough, giving her the room and staying in reach of it both. She broke the seal. She read it once to herself. Then, because 31 men had earned it, and because she'd made this a public thing on purpose from the start, she read it out loud. The clerk of Harlan County had gone to his shelf. He had found a record. Elias Vance, who had married Della Rourke, then Della Kell, in the county in the year he'd walked off. Elias Vance was dead. Somebody let out a breath. Ackley, maybe. Somebody said, "Thank God." Lo. Della kept reading. There was no date. The record the clerk had found only said the man was dead. Word had come back to the county years ago, second hand, from out west somewhere, from the mining camps in the Colorado country. Elias Vance had died out there. But the county had no year written down for it. No month, no day. Just the fact of it, and the fact with a hole in the middle of it where the date should be. Dead. But not when. Della set the letter down in her lap on top of the coffee mill, and she looked at it, and the whole thing turned over on her in front of everyone. Because dead wasn't the question. She saw it before any of them did. Free was the question. And a woman couldn't stand up and vow herself to a second man unless she'd been free of the first at the hour of vowing. If Elias Vance had died last spring, then she was free now. But if Elias Vance had died the year after Josiah first set his wagon against her fire, if the man had lived, out there in the camps, all the way up to some year with no name, then any marriage before that day was no marriage at all. Void, nothing, and the deed rode on the marriage being real. And the note rode on the deed. $640 and a quarter section with good water and a stand of cottonwood, all of it hanging on a date a dead man had taken with him into unmarked ground in the Colorado country. Reverend Coyle came out to the camp that same evening. Somebody had told him, or he'd smelled it, the way he always did. He read the letter himself, holding it to the last of the light, and he was quiet a long time, and then he handed it back gentle. He wasn't cruel about it. That was the worst of it, he wasn't cruel at all. "I can't marry you on this, Della," he said. "You know I can't. A marriage stands on the two people being free to make it at the hour they make it. This says he's gone. It doesn't say when he went. If I say the words over you, and it turns out he was living the day I said them, then I've married you to a lie, and everything built on it comes down, the deed, the note, the both of you before the law and before God." He turned his hat in his hands. "Bring me the day, any proof of the day, and I'll marry you gladly, before this whole camp, and dance at it, but I can't say the words over a hole in the ground." Then he put his hat on and rode off into the dark, a decent man doing an indecent thing, and knowing it, and doing it anyway, because the rule was the rule. Della stood up off the tailgate. She had the letter in one hand and the coffee mill left behind in the other, and she turned to Josiah in front of the men. And her voice was steady the way her hands were steady. "There it is," she said. "Same as I asked you to promise. The words come back and it's near enough to know. I can't prove I'm free. I might never prove it. That man could have lived 20 years out there for all this tells us." She held his eyes. "You stood up in front of these 31 men, and you said if the answer came back no, you'd be the first to say it, right here, so I'd never have to. Well, here's your chance to keep the hard half of it. I'm releasing you, Josiah, in front of them. Don't tie a home and a note and the rest of your years to a marriage that might be no marriage at all. I won't let you." The fire snapped. Nobody breathed. And Josiah Breck, 55 years old, 6 years at her side on the road, took off his hat, which he almost never did, and held it against his chest. "You've got the promise a little wrong, Della," he said. "I said if the answer was no, I'd say it so you'd never have to. But this isn't no, this is we don't know yet. And I never once promised to run from we don't know yet. I've been living inside we don't know yet beside you for 9 years. He took a step closer to her at the fire. "So here's what I've got to offer, and I'll say it loud enough for every man here to swear to it later. Marry me anyway. Tonight, on the plain faith that the day, when it comes, will show what I already know in my bones, that you were free the whole time and the world just hadn't caught up. We'll keep looking for the date. I'll write to every recorder and chaplain and camp between here and the mountains till I find it. But I'm not going to stand out here another season pretending you're not my wife because a clerk in Missouri lost a number." He turned his hat in his hands. "Let the deed say pending proof. Let the note wait. Let the law do what it does slow. But let's you and me do the fast part now, in front of these men, who'll swear to the honesty of it to their graves." Della looked at him a long time. A full minute, maybe. She was good at the full minute. Then she sent Ackley, because it ought to be the youngest, she said later, the one with the most road left to remember it. She sent Ackley riding through the dark to bring Reverend Coyle back. Coyle came. He heard it out. All of it, the marry anyway and the pending proof, and the 31 men who stood up one after another in the firelight and said they'd swear to the day, and the honesty of it, as long as they drew breath. He listened to Pardee, of all people, the old mule skinner who never used 2 words where none would do. Say, "Reverend, I've watched these 2 for 6 years. There's a marriage here already. You'd only be putting a roof on it." And Reverend Silas Coyle, who would not bend the law, found he could bend himself. "I'll wed you," he said, "on the record that he's dead, and on the faith of these men, and on my own eyes, which have watched you 2 longer than I'd admit." and I'll write it down that it's pending proof of the day, so it's honest on paper, as it is at this fire. Bring me that day when you find it, and I'll enter it in the book, and the thing is whole." He almost smiled. God's a patient landlord. I expect he can carry the note a while. So they married at the fire. No church, no organ, no far end of any table, 31 freighters for a congregation, and the prairie dark for a roof, and the coffee mill sitting there on the tailgate for a witness. Coyle said the words. Della said hers in a steady voice. Josiah said his so loud the lead mules stamped at it. And when it was done, the men didn't cheer. Exactly, they weren't cheering men. They took off their hats, everyone, and stood there bareheaded in the cold, and that was louder than cheering. The deed was drawn the next week to hold 2 names, pending proof. The note got its breathing room. And the search began. It took 2 years. 2 years of runs, west and east, the grass greening and browning and greening again. Josiah wrote letters the way other men whittled. He wrote to Denver. He wrote to a claims recorder in the Colorado Gold Country. He wrote to a fort chaplain who was supposed to keep a book of the dead, and, it turned out, mostly didn't. He wrote to camps that had burned down, and towns that had blown away, and men who'd moved on, and left no forwarding. The replies came back slow and useless, one a season if that. One said they had no Elias Vance. One had a Vance but spelled it Vince, and it was the wrong man, alive and cussing in a saloon in the reading of it. One had a burial, an Elias Vance, right name at last, but no year on the marker, and no year in the book, another hole where a date should be, and Della had to sit down on the tailgate when that one came and grind a whole pot's worth of coffee she didn't need, just to have the crank under her thumb. Josiah didn't quit. That was the thing about him. His hands didn't know how to quit. He'd set his wagon against the wind 10,000 times, and he'd write these letters the same way, one more, on the plain faith he'd named at the fire. And in the second year, the winter of it, a letter came from a claims recorder in Denver that was different from all the others. Della read it out loud at the fire, same as the first one, because that's how they'd done everything since, in front of the men. Elias Vance, the letter said, prospector, no next of kin claimed, had died of camp fever in a mining camp above Denver and had been buried by the claims recorder's own predecessor, who kept a proper book, thank God, a book with dates in it. And there was the date. The recorder wrote it out plain, the year, the month, the day. Della read it and stopped. Then she read it again, to herself, to be sure. Then she read the year out loud a second time. Slow, it was 3 years before Josiah ever stood up at that fire and asked her to marry him. Elias Vance had been dead 3 years before the proposal, dead a good while before the flooded Cottonwood Crossing, before the fever she nursed him through, before any of it. Della Rourke had been a widow, free and clear, free to be asked, free to say yes, that entire time. Through every dawn she'd ground his coffee first and thought she didn't dare hope. She'd been free the whole time. The fear had never once been necessary. The promise Josiah made in front of 31 men had never been a gamble at all. The marriage they'd made at the fire, pending proof, it had been a true marriage from the first word. Valid from the very first vow, because she'd been free years before there were any vows to make. The note stood clean. The deed stood clean. And the two of them had spent 2 years searching for a truth that had already been true before they ever started worrying about it. Della sat there with the letter in her lap on top of the coffee mill, and she laughed, once, a short broken sound. And then, she wasn't laughing. Josiah came and stood near her. Not touching, the way he did. They took the Denver record to Council Grove. They took it to Harmon Deal's store. On purpose. Because that was the room where Deal had leaned over his own counter 2 years back, and offered Della the quiet, no questions, no letters, no clerk's marriage, the private promise nobody could ever check on, the exact shape of the thing that had ruined her the first time. Della had refused it without heat. Now she came back to that same counter and laid the record down on the wood. She sent word for Reverend Coyle, and he came, and he read the date out loud in the store so the whole place could hear it, the year, the month, the day, and then the year of the proposal, and then he said, plain, so nobody could miss it, she was free 3 years before he asked. The marriage stands, has stood from the first word of it. I'll enter the date in the book tonight. Harmondale stood behind his own counter and didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. He'd offered her the dark, and she'd chosen the daylight, and the daylight had come out for her. Right there in front of him, on his own wood, in his own store. And Reverend Coyle, to his credit, the rigid man, the rule wearing a face, took off his hat in Deal's store. The rules yielded in the very room that had tried to sell her the secret. Coyle put the record in his coat, careful, like it was money, and went to enter it in the book. Then, they took it back to the fire. The outfit had held their tongues 2 years, 31 men, one turnover and another, so it was more like 40 by then, but the core of them, the ones who'd stood bareheaded at the wedding, they'd never once asked Della or Josiah how the searching went. They'd just waited. Same as they'd waited 11 weeks for the first letter. Same as they'd waited a full minute for her question at the fire, the very first time. Della told them the day had come out right. Free 3 years before the asking. Marriage true from the first word. And it was Pardee who spoke. Old Pardee, the mule skinner, who'd started the whole thing without meaning to, telling green Tom Ackley, low at the fire, about a girl of 19, and a man who walked off inside a year. Pardee looked at the two of them across the flames, and he said the one dry line he had in him. We'd have waited 2 more. That was all. The men who'd witnessed the promise had witnessed it kept. It was later, alone, at the tailgate, that the last thing came. Just the two of them. The camp asleep. The coffee mill between them on the wood. And Della finally asked him the question she'd carried, near as long as the other one. The one about the date. "Why'd you do it in front of the men, Josiah?" she said. "That first time. All of it. Why not come to me at the wagon in the dark like any other man would? Why stand up in front of 31 of them and hand me your whole heart where they could all watch it drop if I let it? You never did like a fuss. Why that? Why like that?" Josiah was quiet a while. He turned his hat in his hands, the way he did when the words were hard. "My mother," he said finally. Della waited. She was good at waiting. My mother was a woman a man promised himself to, private, back east, before I was old enough to know it. No preacher, no witnesses, no paper, just his word to her in a room with the door shut. And when he'd had what he wanted of that promise, he walked off, same as your Vance did, and left her in exactly the place you've been standing these 2 years. Not a wife. Not a widow. Nothing anybody could name. She had his word, and his word was air. She couldn't hold him to a thing, because there wasn't a soul on earth who'd heard him give it. He stopped. His voice had gone rough. I watched her have nothing. I watched her spend her whole life not able to prove a promise a man made her in the dark, and I swore, young as I was, that any promise I ever made a woman, I'd make it where the whole world could hear it and hold me to it. So it'd never be air. So she'd never have to prove it alone. He looked up at Della. That's why I stood up. I knew you couldn't explain yourself. I'd heard Pardee. I knew about Missouri. I knew you were carrying something you couldn't say out loud. So I gave you the witnesses first. I made the promise public, so your question would be safe to ask in front of them. So whatever came back, you'd have 31 men who heard every word and would swear to it. I wasn't putting you on the spot, Della. I was building you a wall to stand behind. And Della understood then, the whole shape of it. Her wanting witnesses and his wanting witnesses were the same want. She'd made her question public, so a man couldn't quietly abandon a private promise the way one already had. He'd made his proposal public, so a woman he loved would never be left holding air the way his mother was. They'd both, each alone, come to the same hard truth, that a private word was the one currency neither of them could ever again afford to trust. They'd been the same person about it the entire time, and never known. She didn't answer him with words. She reached over and took the coffee mill off the tailgate and set it in her lap, and she pulled out the little drawer worn smooth by her own thumb, and she ground him a cup in the dark. The crank turning slow and even, the sound of 9 years and then some. And then, when it was ground, she did the thing she had never once done in all those dawns. She handed him the mill. And she held out her cup for him to grind hers. He took it like it was made of glass. And he ground her coffee, clumsy at first, then steady, and poured it, and set it in her hands. And the two of them sat at the tailgate in the dark drinking coffee they'd each ground for the other, and there was nothing left in the world to prove. 6 months on, the road was done for them. The quarter section at the Kansas end sat in the long grass by the good water, the stand of cottonwood turning gold, and there was a house on it now, a real one, with a window that threw yellow light out across the dark when the sun went down. The note was paid. Both names stood on the deed, clean, no pending, no proof owed to anybody. The station lot did a fair trade off the freight road, and the outfit still rolled through twice a season and ate at Della's table. The same table, only now nobody sat at the far end of it, because there wasn't a far end anymore. It was just a table in a house, and everybody sat wherever. The corner plate had become a place, a real place, set every night, with a chair. The coffee mill sat on their own shelf, over their own stove, in their own house. And most dawns now, Josiah was up before her, and it was the sound of the iron crank that woke her, clumsy still. He'd never have her hand for it. The sound of an old wagon master grinding his wife's coffee in the dark, as often as she ground his. Some mornings they fought good-natured over who got to it first. The county clerk's letter, the one that started it, dead but not when, Della kept. She folded it small, and she pressed it into the back of the family Bible, next to the Denver record with the date in it, the wound and the healing of it pressed flat together between the pages. She folded it in one evening by the yellow window, both names on the deed on the shelf behind her, and Josiah watching her from his chair. And she said the one dry thing she had to say to the whole long road that had taken so long to catch up. It only took the road that long, she said, to find out what was already true. Then she shut the Bible on it, and she got up and she set 2 cups by the mill for the morning, hers and his, side by side, ready for whichever of them woke first. If you're watching this from some long road of your own, if you're carrying a question you're scared to ask because the answer might cost you, comment the town you're watching from, and tell me one thing you've been waiting too long to find out. I've got a feeling it's already truer than you think.